The divorce papers were sitting on the kitchen counter for 11 days before either of them said anything about them. That was the kind of marriage Ryan and Claire Mercer had become, a marriage of things left on counters, things left unsaid, things left too long until they stopped meaning what they were supposed to mean. The papers had arrived on a Tuesday. Claire had placed them there deliberately, the way you place something, when you want it, to be noticed without having to explain why you did it. Ryan had seen them the moment he walked in from work. He had set his keys down next to them, poured himself a glass of water, and gone upstairs. 11 days. They still ate dinner in the same kitchen. They still slept in the same bed, though now with a distance between them that had its own geography, its own borders, its own cold climate. They still said good morning and passed the coffee and moved around each other, with the careful choreography of two people who had once known every inch of each other and now treated each other like furniture they were afraid to scratch. On the 12th day, Claire came downstairs in the grey Saturday morning light, and Ryan was already at the kitchen table with his coffee, and the papers were still there, and something about the specific quality of the silence told her that today was the day. She sat down across from him. She said, "You're not the man I married." She had rehearsed it. She had said it in the shower, in the car, in the mirror in the upstairs bathroom at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. She had said it 100 times. She thought saying it out loud would feel like release, like setting something down that had been too heavy to carry. It didn't. It felt like lighting a match in a room full of things she loved. Ryan looked at her. He had dark circles under his eyes that had been there for so long they had stopped looking temporary. He was 41 years old, and he had the look of a man who had been quietly surviving something for a very long time. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you are measuring whether or not the truth will do more damage than the silence. Then he said, "Neither are you." Not as an attack, not with anger. He said it the way you say something that has simply been true for a long time, and you are only now letting it exist in the open air. Claire stared at him. "What does that mean?" she said. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car passed on the wet street. The refrigerator hummed. The whole house held its breath. "It means," he said slowly, "that I didn't stop being who I was. I just stopped performing who I was. And when I stopped performing, you stopped being interested." They had met in Phoenix, Arizona, 15 years ago, at a mutual friend's backyard party in late September, when the heat had finally broken and the evenings were the kind that make you feel like anything is possible. Claire had been 26, sharp and funny and full of opinions about everything. The kind of woman who walked into a room and rearranged it without trying. Ryan had been 28, quieter, steadier, the kind of man who listened like he meant it. They had talked for 4 hours without noticing. He had driven her home and walked her to the door and not kissed her, which she had thought about for 3 days afterward until he called. They were married 2 years later in a small ceremony in the Arizona desert at sunset with 30 people they actually loved, which was the first good decision they made together and not the last. For a while, for years, honestly, it was real. It was the kind of marriage other people looked at and felt hopeful. They bought a house in Scottsdale. They built things together, furniture, a garden, a life. Ryan worked in commercial architecture. Claire built a career in marketing that she was genuinely good at and genuinely proud of. They traveled. They laughed. They had the kind of arguments that end in understanding rather than damage. Then, somewhere around year 8, something shifted. It didn't happen in a single moment. That's the cruelest thing about the way a marriage can end. It rarely announces itself. It just quietly moves in a direction. And by the time you notice the direction, you're already so far along it that turning around feels like starting over. And starting over is terrifying. So you keep going. You tell yourself it's a phase. You tell yourself all marriages have seasons. You tell yourself the distance is temporary. But distance, if you leave it long enough, becomes the landscape. Claire had begun spending more time with her work circle, dinners that ran late, weekend conferences, a whole world of people who knew her as the polished, capable, impressive version of herself rather than the woman who sometimes cried in the car and couldn't always explain why. Ryan had watched this. happen with the patience of a man who trusted his wife and the growing unease of a man who was starting to feel like a supporting character in her life rather than a lead. He had tried to say it once. About 2 years before the papers appeared on the counter, he had tried to tell her that he felt like he was losing her to a version of herself that didn't quite have room for him. He had said it badly, not with those words, but clumsily, the way men sometimes say the most important things they've ever felt, in the wrong order, at the wrong time. Claire had been tired that night. She had come home late from a work event. She had heard it as criticism. She had said he was being insecure. He hadn't brought it up again. Instead, he had done what people do when they learn that their truest feelings will not be received well. He had put them somewhere else. He had worked more. He had gone quieter. He had become, by degrees, the man who was there without quite being present, which is its own kind of haunting. And Claire had watched him change and told herself it was his fault. "You stopped coming to things," she said now, across the kitchen table. "Events, dinners, my work things. You stopped showing up." "I stopped being invisible," Ryan said. "That's different." "What does that mean?" "It means I went to those things for years, Claire. I stood next to you and smiled and shook hands and made conversation. And every time we drove home, I asked you how you thought it went, and you told me about every person in that room except me. Whether I'd done well, whether you'd been proud, whether I'd contributed or embarrassed or—" He stopped, reset. "You stopped seeing me in those rooms, so I stopped going into them." Claire opened her mouth and closed it. "You never said that," she said finally. "I said something like it once." "When?" 2 years ago, November. You had the blue dress on. You'd just gotten home from the Harmon Group dinner." The silence that followed had weight. She remembered. She didn't want to, but she did. She remembered his face that night. She remembered thinking he was picking a fight because he was insecure. She remembered saying the word insecure, and she remembered now, sitting in this grey morning kitchen, the way his face had done something subtle and final. When she said it, like a door closing very quietly on its way to being locked. "I was tired," she said. "I know," he said. "You were tired a lot. I understand tired. I didn't need you to be endlessly available. I needed you to occasionally look at me like I mattered as much as the rest of it. You did matter." "Claire!" He said her name the way you say a word you've worn out. The way you say something when you need it to carry more than language allows. "You introduced me to your new director in March. As my husband Ryan, with the same energy you used to introduce the parking garage. I drove 40 minutes to be there. I bought a new jacket. I stood next to you all night and you were somewhere else." She felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "I didn't realize—" "No," he said, not unkindly. "You didn't. And that's the whole thing, Claire. You didn't realize, not because you're cruel, you're not cruel. You never were. But because somewhere along the way, I became part of the background of your life. And backgrounds don't require attention. They're just there." She cried. She hadn't planned to. She was not a woman who cried easily or publicly, and she had certainly not planned to cry at her own kitchen table over coffee in a grey morning with divorce papers 3 feet away. But the tears came regardless, the way truth sometimes arrives, without asking permission. "I'm not the villain in this," she said through them. "I worked hard. I built something. I needed support, not—" "I supported you," Ryan said. His voice was still even, still quiet. This was the thing about Ryan that had always both steadied and frustrated her. He did not escalate. He never had. He just held his position with a calmness that sometimes felt like strength and sometimes felt like a wall. "I supported you through the Callaway account falling apart, through your mother's illness, through the year you wanted to quit and start over. I was there, Claire, every version of there. I just needed you to be there for one version of me, and that version was the one that wasn't useful to your career. And that was the version you couldn't see." She pressed her hands over her face. The papers on the counter caught the morning light. "Do you still love me?" she asked. She hadn't meant to ask it. It came out before she could stop it. The realist, most terrifying question, the one underneath everything. Ryan looked at her for a long time. "I never stopped," he said. But loving someone and being able to stay are two different things. I learned that this year. I used to think love was enough. I don't anymore. So what is? What's enough? Being chosen, he said simply. Not needed. Not useful. Chosen. Every day in small ways. Chosen. And somewhere in the last few years I stopped feeling chosen. I felt convenient. And convenient isn't a reason to stay in a marriage. Claire picked up the papers. She did not sign them. She set them down again, differently, not in the deliberate, weighted way she had placed them 12 days ago, but carefully, the way you set down something fragile. I don't want this, she said. Claire, I don't. She looked at him, and her face was open in a way it hadn't been in years, stripped of the polish, stripped of the competence, stripped of every performance. Just her, just the woman he had talked to for 4 hours at a backyard party in September when the heat broke and anything felt possible. I don't want this. I want to know when I became someone who made you feel like a background. I want to know that about myself because I don't recognize her. I don't want to be her. Ryan was very still. That's the first time, he said slowly, that this has been about you and me instead of you and what I did wrong. I know. She exhaled. I know. I've been making you the problem. Because problems have solutions, and the truth is more complicated than a problem. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the sun was beginning to burn through the grey. The way Arizona sun does, suddenly, completely without apology, it came through the window and fell across the table between them, across the papers, across 15 years of a life that was still, technically intact. Ryan reached across the table. He didn't take her hand. He just placed his on the table open, the way you offer something without demanding it be taken. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she placed hers in it, not as a resolution, not as a happy ending wrapped up neatly with everything forgiven and nothing changed, but as a beginning, the terrifying, necessary kind of beginning that can only happen after something has been broken open and examined and finally told the truth. Some marriages end on a kitchen table. And some marriages, the ones brave enough to survive their own honesty, begin there too. If you have made it to this moment, then you know that sometimes the hardest words are the ones we are afraid to say to the person closest to us. Ryan and Claire's story is not just theirs. It is the story of every relationship where love existed, but was never truly seen. If this story touched your heart, then like this video right now. Subscribe to our channel and make sure you send this video to that one person you have been wanting to say something to but never could. Because sometimes one story does what words alone cannot.